Christ is risen.
Christ is risen indeed.
It's my favorite. Y'all, happy Easter to you, to our folks at home. We are here, Easter Sunday, a day that's been celebrated for the past 2,000 years that changed everything. A day celebrated and a story that we know so well. It's so familiar to us for all the times that we've heard it, yet it's one that we always desperately need to hear. That we might never forget that love has won, that Jesus is alive, that we live on the soil of resurrection. And this Easter, this moment, is no exception. So we retell this very familiar story, knowing that as we plumb the depths of this historical yet mystical event of Jesus' death and resurrection, that no matter how many times we've heard it, we've never heard it on this day. At this moment in our lives. Like, we are different today than we've ever been on any other Easter, which means there's a different message for us to hear in it. And man, it is a different world today than it's ever been on any other Easter. So we know the story that Christ is risen. And what the Spirit of God tends to do, though we think we know the story already, God reaches us and surprises us, reaching us into like those intimate particularities of our lives now, which means however you find yourself this morning, whether you're feeling like the full joy and goodness of life, like Christ is risen and you are here for it, right? Or you're just feeling a smidge of it or really just none at all, that's okay. And whether you are someone who loves Jesus or you're just, just a smidge of that, or you're just curious, or you're working through some deconstruction or reconstruction of faith, or you're healing after church wounds from the past, or you just like the vibe of being here and donuts. No matter how you feel or what you do or don't believe, we can come and see for ourselves what this whole death and resurrection stuff means for us now. So my friends, are you game for that this morning? Whoa! All right, well then, limber up, please. Can we just so I'll be honest, I'm not gonna take it easy on you because it's Easter. So we're just we are gonna go for it. So ride that Easter candy sugar high for as long as you can this morning, because we are diving in and we're going long. It's gonna be good. So first, let's give some context. So even as Jesus' death and resurrection are very familiar to us, there are actually 4 different versions of Jesus' death and resurrection, because the Bible, there are 4 different biographies of Jesus, 4 different, what we call books within the Bible. And for those who know, what are the 4 names? What are the 4 biographies of Jesus?
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We call them the 4 Gospels. Gospels just means good news. The good news of Jesus is here. So when we sit down to read each of the 4 versions of Jesus' life, death and resurrection, when we read the whole thing, they're different, right? As we read the different Gospels, which is delightful for a number of reasons. Those discrepancies in detail, according to historians, actually validate versus discredit the authenticity of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection, which is pretty cool. It's also delightful because those different details draw us into different places of wonder and response when we pay attention to them. And they also draw out different themes central to who Jesus is, what God is up to, and who we are. So as we are different each time we hear this story, the story itself has this depth and breadth of differences too. So I could keep kind of geeking out about the differences that are cool in the Gospels, but I think you get it, right? So yes, okay, yep, got it. Thank you. But I want us to just set the stage for where we're headed with this, remembering, okay, there are 4 different Gospels. I want to do that for 2 different reasons. First, we're going to name just one vital similarity that's there across all 4. And then second, we're going to get at one significant difference, which brings us into a super juicy question that we will ask. And then that will draw us deeply into Jesus' death and resurrection for today. So we're going for it. We got some ground to cover. You tracking? Okay, don't worry. It's going to be fun. So let's begin with the vital similarity across all 4 Gospels. The life, death, and resurrection of Jesus show us a pattern. It is the pattern of everything in this world. It is the rhythm of life, death, new life. It's in all things. We see it in the cycles so easily in nature, right? In the cycles of plants and animals and seasons. Man, we just see those daffodils coming up, burrowing their way through the dead leaves of last fall, right? And it's true for the rhythms of our friendships and love and our schoolwork and our jobs, our health, as we ebb and flow through times of ease and then challenge and then relief again. And one way to think about it in this year where we have heard a whole lot of talk about eras, right? Any Swifties in the room, you guys? Yeah, online? Yeah, we see you. So Taylor Swift really names this too, that there are these seasons we move through in our lives. And the way of Jesus is so compelling because it reveals kind of the cyclical pattern of the eras that we live through. So one way to see it is that there are three primary areas we will keep living through, what we call the Jesus eras. That we follow this pattern of life, death, new life. Like our life eras when we are thriving, man, those death times when it's loss and it's suffering and it's challenging. Can I just keep it up there? Can I just leave that up there? Thank you. I just want to yes, thanks. And new life eras, like we come through the other side again and again. This is something we just cycle through that movement through life, death, new life. And the good news in all of our gospels is that this cycle always completes itself. When we find ourselves in death, any kind of ending, suffering, despair, loss, pain, it's not the end of the story. It's not the final era. A new life era is coming because that is the way of Jesus and the way of all things, because Christ is risen. So such is the meaning of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection in all four gospels, and seen. Like I could just send you home like that's enough, right? Like it's just so meaningful. But wait, there's more. So this Easter, this day, we also want to name an important difference between the gospels too. As we do, I invite you just to hold these Jesus eras kind of with you and even begin to get curious about what era are you living in now? Which can be different kind of for different parts of our lives. We might have some different life, death, and new life going on. For me, like parenting a young teenager for the first time is a lot of death era. And as it should be, I know, right? As it should be, though. It's hard as teens strive for independence and navigating technology and boundaries and mental health. So parenting is just a big one for me right now. But I also have these glimpses of some new life energy, like budding as I continue my health journey. So what Jesus eras are you in now in your own life? Where are you in this cycle? So just let yourself begin to land into this and let it come up for you and bring this along as we go, okay? Now, for that difference in the Gospels. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very similar in their style. They're very similar, right? And they're referred to as the synoptic Gospels, as in synopsis, like the summary, the play-by-play, the facts of the story of Jesus' life. That's how they go. And then there's John. So the Gospel of John is just the quirky cousin of the Synoptic Gospels. And for those who've been around Salt House lately, you know we've been talking about and making our way through the entirety of John's Gospel for almost 3 months. Can you believe it? Woo! So they're like, yes, I can't believe it. But we've been in this vast conversation of the deeply mystical and metaphorical and symbolic beauty of the Gospel of John. And for us to stay on course today for Easter, we just need to see that through, right? So we're carrying our journey through John's telling of Jesus's resurrection, which we've just heard, yes? And if you haven't been around for this journey through John, hello. We're so glad that you're here today. That's so great. We want you to be an expert in the Gospel of John as well. So we're just going to have a quick review to kind of catch us all up on the themes of where we've been in John's Gospel so far. So here they are. Previously in the Gospel of John.
One of the driving questions of the Gospel of John. Are you satisfied with your life? And if not, can anything be done about it?
What is it that keeps you from seeing that God is birthing you to new life? What would it be like to set it down, stretch out, and be born anew?
Because John is giving us this intentional, overarching story of who Jesus is. The signs are pointing to who Jesus is, because Jesus is the I am.
I'm coming to you, Jesus says, in weakness and vulnerability, because I refuse to dominate or frighten you. But I have what you need to be able to live Zoe life, and I want to give it to you.
In fact, the most important thing to do is to stop doing and abide in the love of Jesus.
And my kid turned to me and said, you'd get a lot more out of this if you believed.
See, when John began this chapter with how Jesus was loving his own to the uttermost, through to the end, this lens of love, it was explaining not only the meaning of this foot washing, but looking ahead to the very understanding of the cross itself.
But John's theology centers the world through relationships with your friends. How do you forgive your friends? How do you serve your friends?
It's pretty hard to point the finger, to withhold forgiveness, to hold resentment when we're one. Lay down my life for you? Yeah, of course. We're one.
Because he will then tell you that not only does cool not matter, but following him will make you the opposite of cool.
It does encompass, on the one hand, like serving one another, even in like the very menial tasks, right? This foot washing. But on the other hand, this love encompasses heroic acts of great risk. It extends even to the point of giving one's life for another.
All of this is what Jesus calls the hour of his glory. Why? Because it's the greatest demonstration of God's love that the world has ever seen.
So now you're a John expert. So that's John. You're getting a sense of that flavor. Now there are many differences from John compared to the synoptic gospels, particularly when we get to Jesus' death and resurrection. Now this is important. Not only is crucifixion a human horror, but according to the scriptures, it's a sign of divine rejection. So resurrection then, in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the resurrection is Jesus' vindication as he's raised from death by God. What was divine rejection on the cross becomes victory over the cross, over humiliation, rejection, as well as over sin and death. And we know this version of the story, yes? Familiar? Is that familiar to you? Yeah. That's the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But John moves through Jesus' eras of life, death, and resurrection in a different way. Here's the thing. In the Gospel of John, Jesus' death on the cross is never presented as divine rejection, ultimate humiliation, not even close. And we've been hearing this, on Good Friday, we've been hearing it in the sermons. In John's Gospel, Jesus is glorified in and by his death. All along, Jesus has not been saying, oh man, I must suffer and die, and it's going to get bloody on the cross, as he does in the synoptics. Jesus has been on a mission of love, to love his own, to call his disciples friends as they learn and receive and love and receive that love and that oneness that Jesus shares with God the Father. That's been his mission, and he's unwavering in this mission. So there's no Garden of Gethsemane prayer where he's like, can I get out of this, right? There's none of that. Jesus is calmly in charge at his own trial. Jesus' cries from the cross are not cries of anguish, but these are scripted, revelatory statements that end with his final declaration, it is finished. It is consummated, done. Everything that God sent Jesus to do has been accomplished on the cross. Jesus is laser focused on the cross as the destination, for here he plays out his ultimate act of glory. Glory as laying down his life for his friends. So the cross is not divine rejection, but divine reunion. On the cross, Jesus returns to God even as he does what he promised to do, to love his friends through to the end. The cross is Jesus' supreme act of love through which he says, you are my friends. I would do anything for you. Isn't that wild? I mean, it's like such a different focus than Matthew, Mark, and Luke, yes? In John's gospel, it is finished. It is done. It all happens on the cross. So if it is finished on the cross, do we need to be here today? In other words, here's like the huge, juicy question that comes up for me. Y'all, why do we need a resurrection in the Gospel of John? If the cross is Jesus' glory, if he's laid down his life for his friends, if all has been accomplished, then why do we need resurrection? Well, let's take a closer look at the resurrection and see, shall we? Yeah, yes, is that okay? Okay, good. Let's do this through Mary. So roll up your sleeves, man. We're just going to dig in even more into the details about Mary Magdalene and see what's hiding in there. So while it was still dark, Mary heads through the garden to Jesus' tomb. Notice the darkness describes, the current state. It's still nighttime, but also describes the state of her heart. It is still dark. The heavy despair, numbness, darkness of shattering grief. Mary is in a death era for certain, for she has lost her rabbi and friend, which is just important for us to notice as this begins. This grief carries her through her shock of seeing the stone. It's been rolled away, retrieving Peter and the other disciple who come, and then they leave. And after they've left, she continues to weep outside the tomb and peers inside the tomb. And through her tears, she sees the angels. Notice then, she turns around, and there is Jesus. Though Mary doesn't recognize him through her tears, Mary thinks Jesus is who? The gardener. She asks this gardener if he has carried Jesus away and where he is. And then in Mary's despair and tears, we encounter one of the most moving single verses of the New Testament. The utter simplicity and symmetry of John 20:16 is mwah. So here it is. Jesus said to her, Mary. Turning, she said to him in Hebrew, Rabboni. Now, just 2 verses prior, it says Mary had already turned her body around to see Jesus standing there. So when it says turning or turning toward him, it is a turning of the heart. It is a moment of conversion. She's now able to see that Jesus is here with her. And it's such a weird moment. Why didn't Mary recognize Jesus? What then caused her recognition? And this is profoundly and theologically simple. Mary recognized Jesus when he spoke her name, Mary. She had already, been speaking with Jesus. She'd seen him, but she recognizes Jesus when he speaks her name, because this is Jesus, the good shepherd. His sheep are his own, and they know the sound of his voice, and they follow him. And this knowing and being known, it just unlocks something in Mary when Jesus speaks her name, Mary. And in that moment, Mary sees. Her grief, her hurt was blinding. Grief can so blind us from seeing what is right in front of us, yes? It's like a different reality. And then when Mary hears her name, she sees Jesus is here with her in her grief. And not only is Jesus part of what comes into focus for her, but Mary can see that something else has changed, and it's everything. So John has been hinting and nudging in the details since this chapter began. So notice just in that first verse of this Easter gospel, John 21, it begins with this phrase, on the first day of the week. Echoing of the days of the week when God created the world in 7 days, John also places Jesus' tomb and resurrection in the garden, which is not the case in Matthew, Mark, and Luke's resurrection stories. And Jesus is mistaken, again, for the gardener. So John uses all of this to pull the creation stories of Genesis 1 and 2, the Garden of Eden, right? He draws that all into Jesus' resurrection to say that in this garden, because of Jesus' death and resurrection, this is all now new creation. Everything has changed. All of this comes into focus for Mary. So why do we need resurrection in John's gospel? I'll be honest, I look at Mary and I place myself and I place us there with her and I think, man, that sounds pretty good. I need that. We see in Mary one who is blinded by grief and pain and shock, and then it changes. And she's able to see things so differently, to recognize that Jesus is with her in her pain, and to see that it is a whole new world, it is new creation, a new era, which means there's hope and anything is possible. Mary stirs in us our own desperate longing to be able to make that kind of shift, to turn and see in that way. Because for me, although I can be a functioning adult for most of the time, right? I have my own tears of grief and overwhelm and pain, that death that just always comes up, that we always cycle into, and it is blinding. And when I zoom out to include, my loved ones or the wider world, I'm overwhelmed by the pain that I see. that we can sit here and celebrate resurrection while our Palestinian siblings are facing genocide and starvation, rejection of every basic human right, for those same rights and dangers that our queer and trans siblings face every day in this country, for racial injustice, the destruction of our planet. Like, we could spend the morning listing out our laments for the pain of this world. And again, then we also just have our unique pains of our own, our tears that come, whether for ourselves or for our beloveds like Mary. So we see Mary and like, man, we want this. I want the garden and Jesus and like the conversion to see in a new way. Why do we need resurrection in John's gospel? Because John's gospel tells us that we already have it. That Jesus' death and resurrection has changed everything, including, and this is huge, our experiences of the death eras in our lives. Our times when it is still dark with our own heartbreak and pain. These are no longer times where we are abandoned and rejected. Oh, it may still feel awful as it does for Mary. It does not eliminate the pain nor make it good in some way, but we are not alone and there is hope of new creation. John dares to show us that not only was Jesus reunited with God in his own suffering on the cross, but our own times of suffering with Mary as the example. Mary shows us how our times of grief and tears are also places of reunion where Jesus meets us and speaks our name. Could it be that the darkest times are the very place where we hear the voice of our God, our good shepherd? We are met, encountered by the one who has laid down his life for us and promises us that this is not the end. New life is here. Jesus' ultimate act of love, it continues within every suffering we face. As Jesus speaks our name, which opens our eyes and we hear it as the promise of the cross, I would do anything for you. I need this. John's gospel tells us that we already have it. Friends, are you with me? And we see how Mary, she receives this all, right? She receives it and it doesn't stop with Mary. As we read on, Jesus tells Mary, do not touch me. But he says, go and tell the community, because that is where Jesus dwells now, not in his physical body, but he indwells her and he indwells his followers. Mary leaves Jesus and goes to tell the disciples. Did you notice, what does she say? Does she say, he is risen? No, she doesn't. Nobody says that in John's gospel. Mary says, I have seen the Lord. I have seen the Lord. And she tells them what Jesus has said. And we can easily kind of brush right past that as a casual, guess what, guys? I saw Jesus. But this is actually Easter proclamation of resurrection, as shattering as Christ is risen. I have seen the Lord. Jesus sends Mary because this new life, this way of love, this being found in our suffering, it is all absolutely for our own sake, our individual healing, restoration, and being embraced by our loving God. And it has always also been something that we are to share because it is for everybody. And how it reaches everybody is through the shared story of what we have seen. Our turning, our conversion of heart is what leads others to turn also. Just like Mary, I have seen the Lord. So we are to share what we have seen with our friends. Think about it. When you hear stories of God showing up in the midst of the lives of others, what happens in you? I know for me, when you tell me how God showed up in some way, how you felt cared for, or a prayer seemed answered in some way, or you got what you needed just when you needed it. It's like my own encounter with God too. I have seen the Lord. Oh my goodness, me too. That's what happens in us when we speak of what God has done, including, it is the big things, but it's also the little things, from the little coincidences and daily gratitudes of our lives to those big healings and transformations too. But when we speak of what God has done, it grows faith and hope and new life in those who hear it. It becomes another way that Jesus whispers into tears and hearts turn and eyes open. It is through sharing our stories of encounter. That's what can happen when we share what we have seen too. One of the big, beautiful ways that, we've just seen this here at Salt House is in how Trinity Lutherans sharing of what they had seen shaped us. So Trinity Lutheran Church was this building from the 1950s until 2013. And when Trinity closed their doors, and they donated this building and the money that they had left to Holy Spirit Lutheran Church across town, asking them to make something of this place. Trinity Lutheran had lived decades of, just life era, right? I mean, I'm sure cycling through life, death, and new life as well, but man, they had their ups and downs, I'm sure, but when they absolutely faced a final death as they recognized their need to close. Yet in their experience as a dying church, they heard the whisper of Jesus and an invitation to let new life be born in this place, and they said yes. And Salt House was birthed as new life out of Trinity's death, right? 2 days ago on Good Friday was our 9th birthday at Salt House. Woo! I mean, can you believe it? Woo! I'm both like, how's it been that long? I'm like, whoa, it's been that long? It's both of those. But 9 years of continuing as a community to live this cycle of life, death, and new life together. And we can see that cycle in so many ways. We see it in the death and the releasing of our basement in 2016 to become a day center for families experiencing homelessness. Then the death and releasing of our land in 2017 to become Kirkland Place Shelter. 2 shelters, one serving families and the other serving women experiencing homelessness. Trinity Lutheran's story of encounter with Jesus in their death era. Their encounter with Jesus became our encounter with Jesus. Kirkland Place Shelter is a testimony of how we have seen the Lord, right? A public proclamation that because we were met by the generosity of God through Trinity Lutheran, their story of Jesus' encounter turned our hearts. And we share our story of faith through that shelter. Do you see what I mean? You tracking? Man. So that's just like one part of our life together. So there's so many examples in our life together. And what holds true is how this gorgeous love that meets us in our suffering is something we all get to experience, personally, uniquely, and experience together as a whole community. And we get to find ways to speak of it and release it into the world together. And it is through our willingness, like Mary, to see and go and speak of this God that we have seen to our friends. It is through doing that Jesus continues to lay down his life for his friends through you and through me in our world that so desperately needs it. So friends, as we wrap this up, let's get practical about what to do with all of this, because I know it's been a lot. Thanks for hanging in. Still with me? I got some eye contact. It's good. You're good. So let's come back to that question about Jesus eras. What Jesus era or eras are you living in now? For some, we're in the life era, hitting our stride, things are pretty good. For some, it is death. Life is just hard. Whether that's like the one big hard thing or just the accumulation of all the things, life is pretty hard right now. And for some of us, we're in like a new life era, coming out of a time of darkness and beginning to see the possibilities of new life. So in light of all that we've said and today, what is coming up for you? And where are you in these cycles of these Jesus eras? And as you land in that, remember, why do we need resurrection in John's gospel? Because John's gospel tells us that we have it, that Jesus' death and resurrection has changed everything. No matter which era we're in, the greatest challenge for us always, which Mary shows us, is how we see what is now real, right? No matter what era we're in, it's like that challenge of actually seeing and these cycles as they are playing out and seeing what actually is. And I want to offer us a simple tool and prayer to use as we live into the gorgeous meaning of Jesus' death and resurrection. And it's one that Mary Magdalene could have just written this prayer herself, but it comes from Dr. Kate Bowler, who I adore and who I quote often. And the prayer is simply this: God, let me see things as they really are. Can you just say that? God, let me see things as they really are. It is so hard to see things as they really are at any given moment, to even see the present moment for what it is. Our vision gets distorted not only by our tears of grief, but our past hurts and traumas, our expectations of what should be in some way, our fears and our insecurities. And what a prayer to pray, to see the reality of what is as we anticipate the election year ahead of us. Man, let us see what really is. The continued atrocities in Gaza and Ukraine, the endless calls to justice and peace and reconciliation. God, we want to see things as they really are. And as Mary Magdalene demonstrates, we know that our seeing becomes our sending. Jesus' call to action into those places that we can now see to love this world that he loves. So there's so much more to explore with this, which is why next Sunday and the following Sundays, we will finish the Gospel of John together, seeing Jesus' continued intimate moments with his friends as they learn to see him and see what really is in this whole new life thing. Friends, you're not going to want to miss it. So bring all your big questions about how to see things as they really are, because the disciples asked these questions too. And today during communion and after worship, if you missed it at that time, be sure to grab, we have this little card for you. It's your own little Jesus era card to keep in your pocket or as a bookmark on display, as a touchstone for you, as a reminder to give yourself grace for whatever area you're in, and to keep praying to see things as they really are. That prayer's on there too. Which means if we're seeing things how they really are, it means that you are loved, that you are met in your tears, and you're invited to turn and see the risen Jesus who stands before you. Let's pray. God, the story of Jesus' death and resurrection is so familiar to us, yet one that we always desperately need to hear, that we might never forget that love is one, that Jesus is alive, and we live on the soil of resurrection. God, teach us how to see things as they really are, beginning with how we grow our capacity to see you, Jesus, you who call us friend, to recognize you in our lives, to look back and say, there was Jesus. May the song we sing and receive now be beginning of this turning. Help us to see you and live it together. For Christ is risen.
Christ is risen indeed.
Amen.